You know, there are just a few organizations for which I am so thankful, and Stand to Reason is absolutely one of them. Stand to Reason has been really a part of the Summit family for a number of years, both with Greg Koukl, who you're about to meet in person in just a second, or virtually for you guys, and his speaker, Alan Schleman, who's a friend of mine as well. They come to Summit, they train our students, and they do a fantastic job. So we have a privilege today of hearing from Stand to Reason's president and founder, Greg Koukl. He founded Stand to Reason in 1993, and he speaks to colleges and university campuses really nationwide and around the world. He hosts a radio show still. I mean, we're moving up on almost 3 decades at this point. And it's just wonderful. You know, the interviews, the people who call in, and the way he teaches you to talk to them and answer questions. And he is the author of several books. One of those books he's going to be talking about with you today, The Story of Reality, How the World Began, How it Ends, and everything important that happens in between. He also authored Tactics, a game plan for discussing your Christian convictions, and Relativism, Feet Firmly Planted in Midair. So Greg, I'm going to bring you on up, and we'll start you off in session number 2 today with the story of reality. Go get it.
Thank you, Megan. I'm going to start out by breaking a rule here, because when I teach public speaking, I tell my students never start out by saying you're really happy to be here. Because everybody does that, and nobody believes them. And nobody believes them because everybody does that. That's what you're supposed to say, right? Okay, but I'm going to tell you I am really glad to be here. For one reason is because I love representing Summit and partnering with them, and have been doing it over 2 decades now, myself and my team. It's a fabulous organization. Secondly, I love leveraged efforts. And I know that in speaking to you, you are going to pay this forward. You're going to be making a difference in the lives of other students and other adults all over the country, and maybe even in other countries. So I know that the time that I spend here is not just investing in your life, but it's investing in the lives of so many other people that you're going to influence as well. Now, Jeff talked about worldviews as a foundation, and that values and then behaviors are built upon that. Well, I want to talk about that foundation here in my session today. And I hope you have your notebooks and your pens ready, because I want to tell you a story. Now, the story is a story that many are familiar with, but few understand, actually. And that includes people who call the story their own. It's a story about things that really happened, or in some places things that are going to happen. It started a long time ago. It will probably end long after all of us are gone. It's a story about how the world began, how the world ends, and everything important that happens in between. It is the story of reality. Now, there's a problem. And the problem is, when I tell this story, my effort is going to be misunderstood by a lot of people. Let me tell you what I mean. I travel a bit, not as much this last year as I usually do, but I was sitting next to a stockbroker on an airplane once, and he asked me what I did for a living, and this is a standard thing that people say. And I try to jazz it up a little bit. I'm a talk show host, I'm a speaker, blah, 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 because I want them to ask me the following question, the follow-up question. What is it that you talk about on your radio show? What is it that you address at university audiences? What do you do? What is the content? And now I know I'm at a crossroads, because I want to tell them that I speak about religion, and it's particularly about Christianity, and in defending the truth of Christianity. But I realize that when I say that, I'm going to confront a confusion that person has in their mind. And it's a confusion that lots of people have when they think about the religious project. Because most people think about religion, well, they won't say that your religious view is false. I mean, that would be impolite or maybe even intolerant. But they don't think your religious view is really true either, not in a deep sense. Not the way gravity is true, for example. They think it's your true fantasy. All right? And so whenever I'm talking to somebody about my own convictions, all right, I don't even use the word faith, because I don't want them to think about faith fantasy. About my own convictions, I want to speak about it in a very, very particular way. And this is a way that many Christians have not fully grasped, and so therefore they're not as impactful in their culture with their message as they could be. Because if we're not clear about something very particular, we will become victims of that confusion, okay? So what I'd like to do is I want to ask a rhetorical question. And this is a question that you don't have to answer directly to me, obviously, rhetorical. I'm going to answer it for you, but I want you to think about it as if you did have to answer it, okay? Now, here's this question, and you can write this down. What is Christianity? What is Christianity? Now, some people will respond, well, Christianity is a religious system, which that's true as far as it goes. Or Christianity is a guide for living a fulfilling life, and that's true as far as it goes. Or some people might say, well, Christianity is not really a religion at all. It's a relationship with God or with Jesus or something like that. And I think that actually confuses a few people, but I know what you're talking about, okay? And all of those things are true as far as they go, but they don't go far enough, not in my view, because they're too thin, all right? I think the correct answer to the question, what is Christianity, is this. Christianity is a picture of reality. Write that down too. Christianity is a picture of reality. In other words, it's an account or a description or a depiction of the way things actually are. It's a view of how the world is, which is why we call it a worldview, for example. Those patterns of ideas that Jeff was talking about a little while ago. This is a picture, by the way, though, that's made up a lot of different pieces. And so this, in some ways, it's kind of like a puzzle, okay? And in order to make a puzzle, if you're a puzzle worker, you know, to get the full picture, you got to have all the pieces. You can't have any other missing pieces. You can't have pieces of other puzzles mixed in because there's no place for them to fit. Okay? In order to have the full picture, you have to have all the right pieces. Now, let me tell you the way that most Christians' picture of reality looks. It looks like this. Pieces, pile of pieces. Now, you can't see that mess, but you can imagine what it looks like, and I know there's a whole bunch of you that are really annoyed I just did that because even though you're not here, you want to come in here and clean that mess up. It's a pile of pieces. And there may be a lot of the right pieces in there. You've got Jesus, you've got God, you've got the new covenant, you've got Moses, you've got David doing his thing with Goliath, you've got all the great stories, and you've got some of the theological details, but you don't have the picture of the whole thing. In fact, you may even have some wrong pieces that are mixed in there and are confusing things because you don't know they don't belong in your puzzle. And this happens on a frequent basis. People who are naive and are embraced with other worldviews that have pieces of our puzzle in them, they sound like Christianity, they get caught up in that when it's an imposter or a different worldview. I know people who call themselves Christians, for example, that believe in reincarnation. And when they tell me this, I realize this Christian has never put his puzzle together before because the puzzle piece called reincarnation has no place to fit in our puzzle. It doesn't fit in our picture. It's like trying to put a carburetor on a computer. It does no work for us. So how do we put the puzzle pieces back together? Okay, now if you're a puzzle worker, there's a trick. A cheat, some will think, but we can do it here. The way you do it is you look at the picture's cover. In other words, you get the big picture, and then you get an idea where the puzzle pieces fit together. And that's what I'd like to do in the remainder of this session on the story of reality. I want to give you the big picture of Christianity so that you never get lost in the pieces again. Okay, so far what I've talked about is Christianity as a picture puzzle, right? That's great. It's a great way of thinking about worldviews. Now I want to shift the metaphor, and it's something I've already hinted at already. And I want to talk about a worldview that's like a story also. And I think nowadays this is a good way to put it. The Christian story is like many other stories. in that it talks about the great issues that all people struggle with. It talks about the great questions, really, that people ask. It turns out to be a story about peace that is shattered by rebellion. It's a story about love and betrayal. It's a story about conflict and self-sacrifice and redemption, ultimately. So when you think about it, every story has 4 different parts. It has a beginning. In other words, the beginning sets the stage. It tells you who the main characters are, and it actually tells you what kind of world the story is set in, okay? And then you have something goes wrong. You have conflict, all right? And the conflict is really the substance of the rest of the story. Most of the story is about how the conflict itself is dealt with, and then you have a conflict resolution towards the end, and then you have a kind of a restoration or a denouement, the writers call it, where all the pieces come together and they live happily ever after, that kind of thing. Now, the Christian story starts a long time ago. How long ago is a matter of debate, and I'm not interested in that debate at the moment. But what I am interested in is that the Christian story is not like a lot of other stories, because the Christian story does not start once upon a time. And the reason it doesn't start once upon a time is because it is not meant to be understood as a myth or a fairy tale. Now, when my teenage daughter was much younger, actually when she was 5 years old, she began reading The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. And she asked me a question. She said, "Papa, is that story about the lion and the wardrobe and Peter and Lucy and Edmund and Susan, is that a true story?" And I said, "No, honey, it's not a true story. Some stories are true and some stories are not true, and that's a fictional story." It turns out to be a fictional story kind of about a true story. But in any event, I was careful to tell her that this particular story, being a fictional story, is different from the story that we have been telling her, essentially the story of reality. Because our story, the story that the Bible describes, is that this is the way reality actually is. It is not a fiction. It is not a make-believe story. It is a true story. And when I say it's a true story, I mean the word true in its normal sense. I don't mean that it's true for me or true for those people who believe it. I mean it's true to reality. And you see, that's the kind of point that I'm trying to make to a newcomer I'm talking with, like the stockbroker, that what we're talking about is not fiction, but history, about the way the world actually is. Now, I want to tell you why understanding the foundation, the Christian worldview, is so important, for lots of reasons, but 2 that I want to point out right now. And the first is that it's going to essentially help you deal with the 2 most frequently raised objections against Christianity. The very first one is, why is there evil in the world? Why has everything gone so bad? And I just want to point out something. There's one thing that every person knows, no matter where they lived or when they lived, about the nature of the world, and that is that something's not right. Okay, this is not the way things are supposed to be. You do not need to teach people about the problem of evil. They get it. They know it. It's the most salient, or one of the most salient details of reality, okay? And it's understandable that people would raise this question. And it's not just non-Christians, it's Christians. People say, how could God allow this to happen to me? I'm a Christian. I thought I'd be protected from all of these kinds of things, okay? So that's one problem. And if you understand the Christian story, you will see that the problem of evil is not the problem, for Christians at least, that people think it is, all right? That's the first reason it's important to get the big picture right. Here's the second reason, and the second challenge. Why is Jesus the only way of salvation? I mean, that seems suffocatingly narrow to common modern sensibilities. I mean, it's so politically incorrect. It gets Christians in trouble all the time. But it's a substantive part of the entire story, okay? It's not just a little thing somewhere that pops up that we might have gotten wrong, okay? Jesus is the rescuer of the world. How could this be? And when you understand the story, you realize that singular problems, like the problem of evil, often have singular solutions. So the big problem, evil, is answered by the big solution. These are two parts of the same thing. Once you understand the story, you see how those things fit together. Now, what I like to do is I'd like to give you the backbone of the story, the outline, so to speak, and I'm going to give it in 5 words, so it's easy. You can write these down. So here is the backbone. Here is actually the plot line of the Christian story. Here are those words: God, man, Jesus, cross, and resurrection. God, man, Jesus, cross, and resurrection. Those 5 words are like the plot line. They're also the timeline. They tell you the most important things that happen in the order they took place. So our story starts with God, and then he creates man. And then man gets in a heap of trouble, right? And so God initiates a rescue plan by becoming a man himself in the person of Jesus. And by the way, note that in our story, man does not rescue himself. He cannot do that. God must rescue him. And he rescues him by becoming a man in the person of Jesus. And Jesus does something in the way he lives his life and the way he dies on a cross that determines what happens to everyone in the final resurrection at the end of the age. God, man, Jesus, cross, resurrection. How the world began, how it ends, and everything important that happens in between. So now I want to tell you that story. I want to give you the big picture of Christianity. I want to tell you the story of reality. Now, every story has a beginning. And the first words of our story go like this: in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Now, there's so much wrapped up in that opening line pertinent to the story. I want to talk about a couple of the things. First of all, the story starts with God. Why does it start with God? I'll tell you why. Because God is the main character. This is important to understand because we get this confused sometimes, don't we? When I was a kid, my mom used to tell me, Gregory, the world does not revolve, and you could probably finish that sentence, couldn't you? Around you, right? Because that's what your mom's told you, and our moms were right. But when we grow up, we forget that. And we begin thinking that the world revolves around us, and if God is in the picture because we are Christians, now it still revolves around us and God helps us to get what we want, okay? But the story is not like that. The story is not about man. It is not about human beings. The story is about God and God's purposes. So it's not so much, and I mean no disrespect here, but it's not so much about God's wonderful plan for our lives, but about our lives for God's wonderful plan. So God is the central figure because he is the one the story is all about, not human beings. Second, everything belongs to God. Why? Because he made everything. You make it, it's yours. I mean, that's kind of how that works. Now, the reason this is important to understand is because it's very popular nowadays for people to say, well, this is my body, and I can do anything I want to do with my body, okay? Now, this is not true at all in any civilized society. Nobody can do whatever they want with their own bodies, in a civilized society at least. But nevertheless, it betrays a wrong understanding too. Because if God made everything, and that would be us, and everything belongs to him, then we belong to him. Okay? We are not our own in that same sense. All right? Or as C.S. Lewis put it, maybe we are the tenants, but God himself is the landlord. And that is the presumption of the story, that God made everything and everything belongs to him. Now, this also relates to the theme of the story, and there are a lot of people who wonder, how would you capture the entire theme of the story? And people talk about love and redemption and salvation and relationship with God and all of those things, and each of those things are important. But in my view, they're not the theme. The theme is actually captured in the very first sentence and repeated frequently throughout the story in one way or another. Because in the very first sentence you have a king, God, who creates a domain, everything else. So you have the king in his domain, or you have the king in his dom, or you have a kingdom. You see, the story is really about the kingdom of God. God's rule over everything that is rightfully his, which is everything. And there's an insurrection in the kingdom. And the story is about the restoration of everything under the appropriate rule of God. And this is why you see this theme popping up in different places. And much later in the story, you've got a guy named John who is preaching the kingdom of God. And then he introduces a guy named Jesus who preaches the kingdom of God. And Jesus trains a bunch of people to go out after him, and they carry the message of, guess what? The kingdom of God. In other words, they are calling people back underneath the appropriate authority and fathership of the sovereign, the kingdom of God. Okay, I want to make one other observation about the story that's really important, and that is that, you remember I said that the beginning of some stories tell you what kind of world you live in. Well, in this story, reality now consists of two very different kinds of things. Immaterial things and material things, okay? You have the physical world and the non-physical world. So in our story, both of these are real, okay? This is a world in which material things like birds and babies and asteroids and atoms, well, those are real. But it's also a world in which immaterial things like spirits and souls and minds and miracles, these are all part of our story. There's a certain sense in which our story is about a magical world that we live in which there's all kinds of realities that we can't see with our eyes, but there are many ways in which we can interact with them. Now, it's important to see that particular distinction in light of a competing story, which is a very popular story nowadays. And in this story, the view is that matter in motion is all that exists. So you might call it Materism. Philosophers call it materialism. It doesn't matter what the word is that you use, but basically all that exists are physical things in motion governed by natural law. And this story starts in the beginning with the particles, okay? Or as one famous person put it, the cosmos is all there is, or all there was, or all there ever will be, okay? So in this particular story, there is no God. There are no souls, there's no heaven, there's no hell, there's no miracles, and there's no deep morality yet, actually either, because that would be non-physical, and non-physical things don't exist. It's just molecules in motion. Now, of course, this is nothing like our story. It's a competing story of reality. It has a very different set of puzzle pieces in it. Now, and this is usually, by the way, the story that atheists think is true, and secularists, and humanists, and communists. This is their story. Now, I want to tell you why, when it comes to materism or materialism, that this holds absolutely no appeal to me as a thoughtful person. And the reason is something I mentioned earlier. Remember I said that there's one thing that every person knows in the world, no matter how, where he lives, or when he lived, or how old they are, whatever, as they're thinking about things, they all know that something is wrong with the world, okay? That is, I said, one of the most salient features of the real world that we need to explain with our worldview. But on the materism view, there can't be anything wrong with the world. There can't be a way the world isn't supposed to be, because there is no way it's supposed to be, because there's no sposer, to put it one way. All there are molecules in motion. And since the problem of evil is one of the biggest things we all have to resolve, and materism cannot even begin to speak to that, I'm not in the least way attracted to it as a comprehensive view of the way the world actually is, okay? So what we have now is the first piece of our puzzle. It's God. God exists. He's the creator of everything else from nothing else. The world he made is his kingdom, Okay? It includes a world of both mind and matter, physical stuff and non-physical stuff. Both are real. And one last thing. In our story, when God made everything, it was exactly the way His noble mind intended. Everything was just right. Everything was working together just the way He wanted. And this is just another way of saying that everything God made was, and you know the word, good. But now there's a second character in our story that I want to introduce. He's next because he's the most important character in the story after God, and an entire chapter of the story is devoted to the creation of man. God, man. Now, in one way, man is like, and by the way, when I say man, I mean human beings here, okay? I'm an old guy, so I talk this way. But just know I mean generally, inclusively, men and women. And when I get to the fall and how man fell, I just want you to know I think women are just as bad as men are, okay? So it's all inclusive. In one way, human beings are like any other thing in creation. They are made of physical stuff, okay? They are contingent. They are dependent. That means that human beings are not little gods, okay? Some people are a little confused on this particular point, all right? But that doesn't mean they're not valuable and they're not important, because human beings are also made of non-physical stuff too. Our souls are where are the location of our identity. That is, the me that I am is tied more to my soul than to my body. It's where all the functions of your mind take place, your thoughts and beliefs and your intentions and your acts of will, these kinds of things. Now, just a little point here. Having a soul is not what makes human beings different. All right? Having a soul is true of every sentient creature in the world. And the story teaches this. So do you mean, Mr. Koukl, that Fido has a soul? Yeah, Fido has a soul. He's got a very small soul, okay? What about Fifi? Yeah, Fifi's got a soul too. Got a very stupid soul, in my view. We got 3 little stupid souls running around my house right now. But the fact is, all creatures that are sentient have souls, okay? What sets human souls apart from other creatures' souls is that human souls are made in the image of God. Human beings are not gods, but they bear the imprint of God on their invisible selves, and this changes everything. Because this is the image of God in man that accounts for something that we all know, that human beings are different, and they're different qualitatively. They have transcendent value. And we have moral obligations towards each other that we do not have towards other people. We're not supposed to treat people like animals, to put it simply. That's what we tell our kids, okay? And that's because human beings are different. Now, pretty much everybody already knows this, but the Christian worldview has a way of explaining this piece of reality. So it has great explanatory power in that particular area. Something else about the image of God that's really important is having God's image that makes us kind of like God is the thing that makes it possible for us to have a relationship with God, because we are kind of like Him. Now, God gave us a wonderful place to live in. He gave human beings everything they needed to be happy and fulfilled, but the most important thing that He gave them was Himself. Now, there's another detail in this story, though, with human beings. Man was capable of living in harmony with God, with Him, under His control, under His leadership, in His kingdom, but he could also betray the friendship. He could rebel. And in a word, he could be bad. And this is called moral freedom, the freedom to do good or bad. This was true of all human beings. And humans did not use their freedom well. Instead of using it to honor God, they used it to rebel against God. They didn't want to be under God. They didn't want to be under His control. They didn't want to do what He said. They wanted to be independent. They wanted to do their own thing. And so they chose rebellion rather than obedience. And when they did that, everything changed. And I want to tell you precisely how that happened, because there is another important player in the story. He's an intruder. He's a deceiver. He's a mortal enemy of the king, and he tells a terrible lie. He tells Adam and Eve that the king cannot be trusted. Don't listen to him. Find your own way. Make your own rules. Satisfy your own desires. Do your own thing. Be like God. And they think about it for a bit. They toy with the temptation. They consider the lie, and then they give in to the deception. And this one decision, this single act of disobedience, this solitary act of sedition changes everything. Man, enticed by the allure of the sovereign self, I'm in charge, rebels and turns against his Lord, and the kingdom is torn in revolt. But it doesn't bring the freedom that was promised by the deceiver. Rather, it brings brokenness and disgrace and guilt and slavery and struggle. Man is still beautiful. Human beings are still in the image of God, but now there's a huge problem. Human beings are broken. They're morally twisted. They're in active rebellion against God, and they're spiritually dead, which means they're unplugged from the only source of real life that they have access to, and they are incapable of plugging themselves back in. And they are enslaved by two new masters. One of them is Satan, and Satan is not some guy in red tights with a pitchfork. He's a real, powerful, spiritual force that they chose to follow rather than their loving Heavenly Father. And so they're enslaved to him, but they are also enslaved to their own twisted and corrupted nature that the story calls the flesh. They are guilty against the sovereign of the universe and lost. And the king is angry. Oh, wait a minute, wait. Everything was going okay until you got to this spot. Now you're going to give me hell, fire, and brimstone and all that stuff. Look, I thought your God was a loving God, okay? So here's my question if you're thinking that. Pardon me. What makes you think that God is loving? Well, he's good, right? Yeah, he's good. Well, then he'd be loving too, wouldn't he? Yes, he is loving because he's good. Well, then what's all this anger and wrath stuff that you're talking about? Why is he angry? Because he's good. In other words, the same thing that grounds or undergirds his love, his goodness, also grounds and undergirds his anger against badness, because God would not be good if he simply let evil people go free. And this is not good news. And by the way, this is why there's evil in the world. You want to know why things are so bad? Because of this. Listen, you as parents know this, but the students listening, your parents give you rules, right? Oh, you don't like those things. So they're boundaries. You want to go outside of the boundaries. Let me tell you why they give you rules. Because they know it's outside the boundaries. They know it's dangerous out there and it's safe in here. They've been around for a while. And they know if you go outside of those boundaries, you're going to break something. Now, something you might break might be mom's dish or dad's tool, or you might break a relationship, or you might break a life. And sometimes the breakage is irreparable. This is exactly why God gives us boundaries, because inside the boundaries there's safety. We go outside the boundaries, things get broken. And when our first parents went outside of the boundaries, they completely jumped right out of beyond the boundaries. They broke their relationship with God. They broke their relationship with each other. They broke their relationship with the environment. They broke the whole world. And this is why things go bad, because a broken world produces broken lives and broken circumstances. You see, our story explains why there is a problem of evil. Now, there's two important things I want you to know, by the way, about it, and the first I just hinted at. First one is, evil's part of our story. It starts in the 3rd chapter. It doesn't get solved until 66 books later. Our entire story is about the problem of evil. If there's no problem of evil, there'd be no story. Here's the second thing. Our story is not over yet. We're just in the middle of the story. Imagine you picked up something like The Lord of the Rings and you started reading through it, and it's all this happy adventure, these hobbits and the elves are on, and you got a dwarf and you got other people, and they're just taking their little adventure and having their good old time, and all of a sudden they get trapped in this cave called Moria, and the goblins are after them, and Gandalf gets whacked, and the big eye is looking down at them, and everything's a mess. And you think, what a lousy story. Keep reading. The story's not over yet. And with man lost and helpless, God himself steps into the picture in a very unique way to rescue human beings and solve the problem of evil, God, man, Jesus. Now, there are 2 important things you need to know about Jesus, and neither have anything to do with his teachings in general. In other words, if you know about the teachings of Jesus and you get these 2 things wrong, you miss the whole picture. That is, who Jesus was and what he came to do. Who Jesus was and what he came to do. Classically known as the person and the work of Christ. So, who was Jesus? Well, Jesus was a human being. He had a human birth. He lived a human life. He had human feelings, emotions. He ate, he drank, he slept, he got tired, he had joy, he had grief, he had pain. Jesus was one of us. He was just like us in all of those ways. Every way that makes us distinctly human, Jesus shared in that. Okay, but he was more than that. Our story says starts in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Here's the way Jesus' story starts. In the beginning, that's that same beginning, was the Word. And the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He was in the beginning with God. All things came into being through him, and apart from him, nothing came into being that has come into being. And what John the Apostle is telling us at the beginning of his account of Jesus' story is that this person called the Word, who became flesh, he writes, and dwelt among us, and we beheld his glory as of the only begotten of the Father. This is the same one that was in the first line of the very beginning of the story, who made everything else. In other words, Jesus was a man, but he was also God. He was the God-man. He was Emmanuel, God with us. Now, for that to happen, think about it. Something amazing has got to take place for God to go from there down to here and be with us. And I want you to think about when you're dealing with your children, especially when they're small and they're scared and they're frightened and maybe crying, how do you calm them down? Don't you kind of crouch down a little bit before them? Don't you just almost kneel down? You get down at their level and you engage them and you try to comfort them. You get small. That's what God did. God got small. He got down off his throne and he came and he dwelt among us to be a servant. Though he existed, the story says, in the form of man, he did not regard equality with God a thing to be held on to, but he came down as a man to be with us, and not only to serve us, but to die for us the death of a common criminal. That's who Jesus was. He was the God-man. And so that's the answer to our first question, who is Jesus? And by the way, this is not the Jesus of Islam. They have a Jesus. It's not this Jesus. This is not the Jesus of the Jehovah's Witnesses. It's not the Jesus of your LDS friends. This is not the Jesus of your New Age friends. Those are different stories. Now our second question, why did Jesus come and what did he come to do? Let me tell you first what Jesus did not come to do. Jesus did not come to help the poor, teach us to help the poor and restore social justice. Now, I know some people are hearing this and they say, bite your tongue, Koukl. But I want to tell you something. What if I were to say that you could take every single thing that Jesus ever said about the poor or social justice or anything like that and remove it from the story, and you would not affect his purpose one single bit. Well, that's exactly what one of his closest friends did. The Apostle John, at the end of the first century, when he penned one of the most elegant characterizations of the person and the work of Christ, called the Gospel of John, did not include in it a single word regarding teaching about helping the poor or social justice. Not a single word. Does that mean Jesus didn't care about it? No, it didn't mean he didn't care about it. He did. It means it's not the reason he came. And if that's what you think, you're getting it wrong. You're missing it. Why did he come? Well, let's listen to the words of the story. Actually, Jesus himself. I did not come to call the righteous, but sinners to repentance. I came to give my life a ransom for many. I came to seek and to save that which was lost. I came that the world might be saved through me. Now, to save means to rescue from imminent danger. So we're in danger. Jesus came to rescue us. Well, what's the danger? What was Jesus rescuing us from? Now, fasten your seatbelts, because a lot of people don't like it when I say this, but it's good theology. Jesus came to rescue us from the Father. Remember, it's the king who's angry. He's the one who's offended. He's the one we've rebelled against. Jesus said, don't fear him who can kill the body and not the soul. That's other human beings. Fear rather him who can throw body and soul into hell. The story says it's a terrifying thing to fall into the hands of the living God. We don't want to do that. We want to be rescued from that. And how did Jesus rescue us? Well, he made a trade. His life for ours. And if that seems hard to describe, let me just tell you something. I was talking to a young lady on an airplane. She was a Muslim woman, and I was telling the description between the difference between the God of the Bible and the God of the Quran. And I said to her, we were on an airplane, so I said, let's say our airplane was hijacked. Of course, I'm whispering at this point. And the terrorists came down the aisle, and they wanted to take you and cut your throat and throw you out in the tarmac as a sign to everybody. And I put my arms in front of you, and I said, don't take her, take me instead. What would you think of that? I asked her. She said, I can't imagine anybody doing that for me. And I said, that is exactly what God has done for you in Jesus. Not Allah, Yahweh, not Muhammad, Jesus. To satisfy justice, God came down. He stepped out of heaven, dwelt among us, and Jesus said to the Father, take me instead. And the trade took place on a small outcropping of rock outside the walls of Jerusalem. The locals called it Golgotha, the place of the skull. We know it as Calvary, the place of the cross. God, man, Jesus, cross. Now, very briefly, there's so much I could say about this, that crucifixion is a cruel form of punishment, all right? And people die generally by asphyxiation. It's brutal, okay? And the torment, though, of the cross that Jesus experienced was deeper than the physical pain of the cross or the lashings that he'd received. It was a dark, a terrible, incalculable agony, an infinite misery as God the Father poured his wrath upon the rest of, on his son, as if his son were guilty of some immeasurable evil. Now, why punish the innocent one? On the top of his cross was a titulus. It said King of the Jews. That was the crime that he allegedly was being punished for. But according to the Apostle Paul, in Colossians, there was another titulus, so to speak, a certificate of debt that was nailed to the cross. And it consisted of decrees against us. Our crimes were nailed to Jesus' cross. And in the ancient Near East, people would write the word tetelestai across their bills when the bill was paid for. And as Jesus was there, and then the 3 hours while the cloud shrouded the cross, receiving the agony, the punishment for every sin that we have ever committed. When he was done, just before he released his spirit to the Father, he said one word, tetelestai. Now, the Bible translates that it is finished, but he wasn't saying, I'm glad that's over with. He's saying, I've done it. I've completed it. I've finished the task. The trade is complete, so that those who trust in him will get his righteousness because he has taken the punishment upon himself. And the way we benefit by that is putting our trust in Jesus, and this is what the story calls faith. It can't be earned, it can't be bought. And the decision that you make about that last thing will determine what happens to you in the last phase, the final resurrection. God, man, Jesus, cross, resurrection. And in that stage, one of two things is going to happen at the end of the age. Either perfect justice or perfect mercy. Perfect justice is punishment for everything you've ever done wrong, and God misses nothing. But perfect mercy is forgiveness for everything you have ever done wrong, and God misses nothing. The decision you make about Christ will decide what happens at the final resurrection. So I've just told you a story. If you're a Christian, this is your story. If you're not a Christian, this is also your story. Because this isn't just a religious myth or a fable. This is the story of the way things actually are. The story has 5 elements: God, man, Jesus, cross, resurrection. It's a story about how the world began, about how the world ends, and everything important that happens in between. The beginning filled with goodness, the rebellion, the brokenness, the rescue, the trade, the mercy, the final justice and the end of evil, the ultimate restoration to perfect goodness. And for those who trust the rescuer, the unending friendship with a Father who finally satisfies the deepest longings of our hearts. The way C.S. Lewis put it was, the door that we have been knocking on all of our lives will finally open. But it's not just a story. It's a true story. It is the true story. It is the story of reality. Father, I just want to pause for a moment and thank you for all the rest of us who have tasted of the goodness of this story, even though in this lifetime we'll never know the fullness of it, the significance of it. But by your grace and your mercy, you have helped us to see how we can be rescued through the one and only rescuer, the only one who solves the problem of evil, your Son, Jesus of Nazareth, and we thank you for him, for Christ's sake.